The grapes of draft. As most high school students in the United States know, John Steinbeck won a Pulitzer and Nobel Prize for Literature for The Grapes of Wrath. Originally published in 1939, it's a novel about displaced Oklahomans resettling in California's Central Valley. While Steinbeck was determined to tell the human story of the consequences of reaping the wrath of what had been sown in the Great Plains, especially in western Oklahoma, he gave us a sobering glimpse of the primary causes of the Dust Bowl that had set the migration of Oklahomans in motion. It's helpful to know that humans have always migrated in search of better environs and less competition for resources. That situation was no different for Steinbeck's Okies, and it was certainly not any different for the Tennesseans and Kentuckians who had become Oklahomans a generation or two earlier. Let us not forget that Tennesseans and Kentuckians had been Carolinians, Pennsylvanians, and Virginians before settling west of the Appalachians. And before they were Pennsylvanians and Virginians, they were Irish, Scots, German, English, Asian, and African folk. With new rural places to settle and carry on with an agrarian life as they knew it, there was no reason to change or adapt. Such was the case with the Okies and their migrating ancestors. Let's talk about people in the Great Plains. When Northwestern Europeans first arrived in North America in the 17th and 18th centuries, they brought limited farming knowledge with them. The Germans were perhaps the best farmers, having already fabricated effective plows for busting clods of earth. The Scots and the Irish were primarily pastoral peoples, and for safety reasons, they often settled in upland places that weren't very good for farming, but they could see the enemy coming. Africans and English folk had learned deep plow agriculture in the coastal plains where cotton and tobacco were grown. The Cherokee, Creek, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Seminole, and Shawnee who preceded them to Oklahoma used farming methods that they had developed themselves over generations, as well as from others that they knew back in the East. North of Oklahoma and before white settlement on the Great Plains, Mandan, Arikara, and Hidatsa lived a sedentary lifestyle along the Missouri River. Collectively, the people who settled in Oklahoma and the Great Plains were not well-informed farmers. There were no traditions of contour farming, crop rotation, which was pioneered in the South by Professor George Washington Carver, or no-till agriculture. Despite Professor Carver's encouragement of Southern farmers to plant legumes to enrich the soil, most of the Central Appalachian folk who settled in Oklahoma had no idea that chelating agents were present in the root systems of legumes such as clover, alfalfa, peanuts, or soybeans. Chelating agents are agents that hold or bond the soil nutrients together. Like their ancestors, when game or land fertility played out, they picked up their belongings and moved west to settle presumably better lands. By the time Oklahoma became a state in 1907, the continent had been settled, and there were very few places in which an independent-minded farmer could resettle without someone already laying claim to that coveted space. That was the situation Oklahomans found in California's Central Valley. That's where they picked up the derogative label, Okie. It may not be apparent, but the seeds of the Dust Bowl were planted thousands of years ago in the human practice of migrating away from places plagued by too many people competing for too few resources. The Great Plains region was the last American region to be settled. California had become a state in 1850, Oregon joined the Union in 1859, and Washington in 1889. The United States government actually had to offer incentives to get people to settle in the Great Plains because in the decades prior to the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854 and the Homestead Act 1862, which featured allotments of 160 acres per claim, the treeless plains had little appeal. It was assumed by many that the absence of trees was a clear sign that the prairie soil was unfit for farming. Trees were also a resource needed for fuel and for building homes and barns. It was no small wonder why the Oregon Trail cut through the Great Plains on its way to the forested lands of the Northwest. These negative attitudes toward the Great Plains were certainly reinforced by the notion that the interior of the continent had been known as the Great American Desert. Interestingly, and perhaps surprisingly for some of you, one of the few people to write about the rich fertility of the interior of the country was General George A. Custer, who wrote an autobiography that was published in, I think, 1872, in which it was called My Life on the Plains. The Great American Desert, nonetheless, was a rather dismal and wholly inaccurate name given to the region. It first appeared in an 1823 report written by Major Stephen H. Long. However, the seeds for the unsuitable for cultivation assumption about the plains were planted nearly 2 decades earlier. From reports made by such figures as Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, who explored the area between 1804 and 1806, and Zebulon Pike, who was in the area between 1806 and 1807, Easterners developed the idea that the continent's inner parts were incapable of commercial farming. The Homestead and Kansas-Nebraska Acts of 1862 and 1854, respectively, attracted thousands of families onto the Great Plains. Within weeks of the passage of the Homestead Act, Oklahoma Territory climbed from a few hundred non-Native Americans to approximately 60,000 settlers. It was a seemingly mad rush to claim parcels of 160 acres per allotment. Perhaps encouraged by a vengeful federal government over the tribe's alliance with the Confederacy, white settlers were encouraged to move to Oklahoma, and they soon outnumbered the eastern tribes that had arrived there in the late 1830s. From 1860 to 1910, 234 million acres passed from public ownership to private ownership. By 1900, the population of settlers who supported themselves as farmers or ranchers was nearly 400,000. In 1860, Oklahoma was known as Indian Territory. But in 2000, that is the year 2000, only 7.9% of the state's population was Native American, and another 4.5% claimed a mixed race identity. The relatively drier climate in the central and western portions of the state was the primary limiting factor in developing a commercial agricultural economy based on 19th century technology. Kansas and Oklahoma's landscape and their vegetative cover changed remarkably from east to west. The elevation also steadily climbs in the western reaches of the Great Plains. In describing the relative flatness and treelessness of western Kansas, a fifth-generation Oklahoman, Dr. Jim Atkinson, jokingly told me once that when he was young, he watched his dog run away for 2 days. Western Kansas and Oklahoma are indeed vast open spaces. For people accustomed to urban environments or hilly forested areas, the wide open vistas punctuated by the sensation of dry prairie winds blowing across the skin leaves a lasting impression. In the next section, we'll pick up with the trail going west across the plains. If you enjoy programs like this, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. See you next time here on The Vantage Point.